You need to step back from this counter right now.
I'm waiting to check out. Is there a problem here?
Management needs to handle this situation immediately. Sir?
You might want to reconsider your approach here. Just some advice.
The fluorescent lights of the supermarket shone over the organized aisles that Tuesday afternoon when an absolutely shocking confrontation began to unfold at checkout counter number 5. What should have been a simple purchase transaction turned into a spectacle of racism so blatant, so brazen, that security cameras captured every second of a white man completely losing his composure and ordering a black customer to step away from the counter. But karma was watching through those cameras, and what happened in the next few minutes would prove that some people really do get exactly what they deserve. Before we dive into this instant justice story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Leave a comment with your city or country. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, please hit that subscribe button because stories like this need to be shared. You'll want to watch until the end to witness the exact moment everything falls apart for this man. The supermarket in question was a medium-sized establishment in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other in the aisles and staff knew regular customers by name. It was a normal Tuesday in March, around 2 in the afternoon, a time when the store was moderately busy with retirees doing shopping, mothers with small children, and some people on lunch breaks grabbing quick items. The atmosphere was relaxed, peaceful, exactly as it should be in a place where people simply go to buy groceries. The black man at the center of this story was named Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old software engineer who worked remotely and had left home to buy some items for dinner. Marcus was the type of person who went unnoticed in most places, always polite to store employees, always patient in lines, the kind of customer any establishment would love to have. He was wearing simple casual clothes, a light blue t-shirt and jeans, nothing that would draw attention in any way. He had spent about 15 minutes in the store, picking up fresh vegetables, some spices, and a package of chicken. When Marcus arrived at checkout 5, there was only one person ahead of him, an elderly lady who was finishing bagging her groceries. He placed his basket on the counter and waited patiently, checking his phone while the cashier, a young woman named Jessica, about 22 years old, helped the previous customer. It was a completely normal scene, repeated thousands of times daily in supermarkets around the world. There was nothing wrong, nothing suspicious, nothing to justify what was about to happen. The man who would cause complete chaos was named Richard Peterson, a 58-year-old white man with a history that would soon come to light. Richard had entered the store a few minutes after Marcus and had grabbed only a few items, some cleaning products and a bottle of wine. He approached the checkout 5 line and stood behind Marcus at a normal distance anyone would maintain. But from the moment Richard positioned himself behind Marcus, something changed in his expression. His jaw became tense, his eyes narrowed, his body became rigid in a way that signaled he was bothered by something. Marcus didn't notice initially. He was still looking at his phone, patiently waiting his turn. The elderly lady finished her transaction and left, and Jessica began scanning Marcus's items. Everything was progressing normally until Richard stepped forward, invading Marcus's personal space in a way that was clearly intentional and aggressive. Security cameras captured the exact moment Richard got too close, standing just inches from Marcus's back. Marcus felt the presence invading his space and turned his head slightly, giving a quick look back to see who was so close. When he saw Richard practically breathing on his neck, he politely took a small step to the side, creating more space. It was a completely reasonable reaction, the kind of adjustment anyone would make when someone is too close. But for Richard, that small movement was apparently an offense. His face turned red, his nostrils flared, and then he said the words that were captured perfectly by security cameras and that would completely change his life. Richard ordered Marcus to step back from the counter, saying he was in the way, that he was taking too long, that people like him always slowed everyone down. The tone was venomous, loaded with an implication that anyone listening would immediately understand. It wasn't about Marcus taking too much time. He had literally just started having his items scanned. It wasn't about being in the way. He was in the exact position any customer would be during a transaction. It was about Marcus's skin color, and Richard wasn't even trying to hide it. Marcus turned completely to face Richard, his expression showing a mixture of confusion and contained frustration. He calmly asked what exactly Richard meant by that, why he was being ordered to step away when he was simply paying for his groceries like any other customer. Marcus's voice was controlled, but there was a firmness in it that made clear he wasn't going to simply accept this kind of treatment without questioning. He knew this game. He had experienced variations of it throughout his life. Richard didn't back down. Instead, he became more aggressive, raising his voice enough that other people in the area began to notice something was wrong. He said Marcus was taking too long, that he should have his items ready, that he was holding up everyone behind him. It was absurd because Marcus literally had 3 or 4 items being scanned, and there was no one behind Richard in line. There was no line forming. There was no rush. It was purely about Richard wanting to exert some kind of dominance over Marcus. Jessica, the cashier, stopped scanning items and looked between the two men, clearly uncomfortable with the situation developing right in front of her. She was young, probably in one of her first jobs, and wasn't trained to handle racial confrontations at her register. She tried to diffuse the situation by saying everything was fine, that Marcus wasn't taking too long, that everyone would get their turn. But Richard completely ignored her, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that went beyond simple impatience. Other customers began noticing the confrontation. A woman, 2 lanes back, stopped putting her groceries on the belt to watch. A man passing by with his cart slowed his pace, sensing the tension in the air. A teenager working stocking shelves nearby stopped what he was doing and stood watching, his hand already moving discreetly toward the radio all employees carried to call management if necessary. Security cameras captured everything from multiple angles, preserving every second of this interaction. Marcus maintained his composure in a way that was impressive given the situation. He told Richard clearly that he wasn't doing anything wrong, that he was simply paying for his groceries, and that Richard needed to back off and wait his turn like any civilized person would. The tone was firm, but not aggressive, the kind of response someone gives when defending their rights without escalating to violence or shouting. Marcus was very aware that as a black man in a confrontational situation, any wrong move on his part would be used against him. Richard responded with something that made several witnesses gasp audibly. He used a racially charged term, not the N-word directly, but something equally offensive, suggesting Marcus should go back to where he came from, that people like him didn't belong in that neighborhood, in that store. The mask of civility had fallen completely. Richard was no longer just being rude or impatient. He was being openly and brazenly racist, and he was doing it in a public space with multiple witnesses and cameras recording every word. The tension in the air became palpable. The woman 2 lanes back pulled out her phone and started recording. The man with the cart stood still, clearly shocked by what he was hearing. Jessica, the cashier, finally grabbed her radio and called for a manager, her voice trembling slightly as she reported there was a situation at Checkout 5 that needed immediate attention. The teenager stocking shelves also had his phone out, capturing the confrontation from another angle. Marcus took a step toward Richard, not in a threatening way, but in a deliberate and controlled manner. He said something the cameras captured perfectly, something that would become a quoted line when the story went viral. Marcus told Richard he could have his ignorant opinions, but he didn't have the right to harass other customers, that his words were being recorded, and that he had just made a very big mistake by choosing to express his racism so publicly. The delivery was calm, but absolutely devastating. The store manager arrived in less than a minute, moving quickly between the aisles when he heard the urgent tone on Jessica's radio. His name was David Chen, a 45-year-old Asian American man who had managed that supermarket for over a decade. David had experience dealing with difficult customers, price disputes, and occasional shoplifting attempts. But when he arrived at Checkout 5 and assessed the scene, he immediately realized this was something different. The tension was visible, multiple phones were recording, and he could see from the body language that this had escalated beyond a simple customer complaint. David approached with his hands raised in a universal gesture of pacification, his voice calm but authoritative as he asked what was happening. Jessica immediately began explaining that Richard had started harassing Marcus for no reason, that he had used racially offensive language, and that she had called for help because the situation was getting out of control. Several other customers who were watching confirmed Jessica's account, saying they had heard everything and that the white man was clearly the aggressor. Richard immediately changed his behavior in the manager's presence. His voice became more controlled, though still loaded with barely contained anger. He began complaining that Marcus was being slow, that he was holding up the line, and that when he politely pointed this out, Marcus became aggressive and confrontational. It was a complete rewrite of what had happened, an attempt to paint himself as the victim and Marcus as the problem. Richard was clearly experienced in manipulating situations to his favor. But David wasn't a manager for 10 years for nothing. He knew how to recognize when someone was lying, and he had multiple witnesses all contradicting Richard's version. More importantly, he knew the entire store was covered by security cameras that had captured every second of the confrontation. He told Richard calmly that they would review the footage, but that based on multiple witness accounts, it appeared Richard was the one causing the disturbance. Richard didn't like that. His face became even redder, and he began raising his voice again, demanding to speak with someone above David, saying that, as a loyal customer for years, he deserved better treatment, that he wasn't going to stand there and be accused of something he didn't do. He pointed at Marcus and said something about always having problems with those types of people, a comment that made David clench his jaw in visible frustration. The cameras captured every word, every gesture, building a case that would be impossible for Richard to deny later. Quick question for those watching. Have you ever witnessed racism happening right in front of you in a public place? How did you react? Leave it in the comments. David made a decision. He told Richard clearly and firmly that he needed to ask him to leave the store immediately. He explained that harassing other customers and using racially offensive language was not tolerated, that Richard was not welcome to complete his purchase, and that if he didn't leave voluntarily, police would be called. David's tone left no room for negotiation. This was not a request. It was an order from a manager exercising his authority to protect another customer. Richard was stunned for a moment, clearly not expecting to be kicked out of the store. He began arguing, saying he knew the owner, that he had shopped there for years, that this was an outrage. But David remained firm, repeating that Richard needed to leave now. Other employees had begun gathering, forming a supportive presence behind David. The message was clear. Richard wasn't being served here, and he had no allies. That's when something completely unexpected happened, something no one there could have predicted, but that security cameras captured in perfect detail. A woman who had been shopping in another aisle of the store heard the commotion and came to investigate. When she saw Richard, her face changed from curiosity to absolute shock, and then to something that looked almost like satisfaction. She approached the group gathered at Checkout 5, her phone already in hand, and said something that made everyone present stop and pay attention. The woman identified herself as Margaret Richardson, and she said she knew Richard Peterson very well. In fact, she was the human resources manager at the company where Richard had worked for almost 20 years. She had come to shop during her lunch break and never imagined she would find one of her employees having a public racist meltdown at the local supermarket. The coincidence was so unlikely it seemed almost scripted, but it was happening in real time, being captured by multiple cameras and phones from all directions. The color drained from Richard's face when he recognized Margaret. His eyes widened, and you could see panic beginning to set in as he processed what had just happened. His HR manager hadn't just heard about the incident from third parties or seen a video online later. She was literally there, had personally witnessed his racist meltdown, and from the look on her face, she was not impressed. Karma had arrived faster than anyone could have imagined, and it was wearing a corporate HR badge. Margaret wasted no time. She said loudly enough for everyone around to hear that she had witnessed the last parts of the confrontation, that she had clearly heard the racially charged language Richard had used, and that, as a human resources representative for his company, she was absolutely shocked and embarrassed. She took out her phone and began making notes, documenting everything while it was still fresh in her memory. The implications were obvious to everyone watching. Richard wasn't just being kicked out of the supermarket, he was about to face much more serious consequences at work. Richard began stuttering, trying to explain, trying to minimize what had happened. He said Margaret hadn't heard the full context, that it had been a misunderstanding, that he was just frustrated with slow service. But Margaret cut him off, her voice professional but cold. She said there was no context that justified the language she had heard him use, that harassing other customers based on race wasn't a misunderstanding, it was clear discrimination. And then she said something that made Richard fully realize the gravity of his situation. She would be filing a formal report as soon as she returned to the office. Marcus, who had remained relatively quiet while watching this unexpected turn, finally spoke. He thanked Margaret for speaking up, thanked David for taking a stand, and thanked the other witnesses who had stayed to corroborate what happened. He said he was tired of situations like this, tired of having to maintain composure while being harassed for simply existing in public spaces. His voice was loaded with emotion now, the adrenaline from the confrontation beginning to dissipate and being replaced by the exhaustion of having to deal with racism on a regular Tuesday. The crowd of witnesses began expressing their support for Marcus verbally. The woman who had been recording on her phone approached and said she would send the video to Marcus if he wanted it for his own documentation. The man who had stopped with his cart said he would be happy to give an official statement if needed. Other customers nodded in agreement, some people even applauding, when David reaffirmed that Richard needed to leave the store immediately. It was a rare moment of community solidarity, people from different backgrounds coming together against something everyone recognized as wrong. Richard finally realized there was no way out of this situation. No amount of arguing or manipulation was going to change the fact that multiple people, including his own HR manager, had witnessed his behavior. He abandoned his items at the checkout and began walking toward the exit, but not before muttering something under his breath that the cameras picked up, but most people didn't hear clearly. It appeared to be more insults, unable to let go of his hatred even when defeated. David instructed one of the employees to escort him to the door and make sure he actually left the property. He also grabbed his radio and informed the security team that Richard Peterson was no longer welcome in the store and should be prevented from entering if he tried to return. The ban was immediate and final. When Richard finally walked out through the sliding glass doors, several people were still recording, capturing the final moments of his public humiliation. Once Richard had left, David turned his attention back to Marcus. He apologized profusely for what had happened, saying that type of behavior was not tolerated in his store and that he was sorry Marcus had to experience this. He offered to make Marcus's groceries free that day and gave him a substantial gift card as additional apology. Marcus accepted graciously, though he made clear that no amount of apologies or gift cards could truly compensate for the indignity of what had just happened. Margaret approached Marcus as well, apologizing on behalf of the company that employed Richard. She said his conduct did not reflect the organization's values, that they took discrimination extremely seriously, and that there would be consequences. She asked for Marcus's contact information, saying the company might want to reach out as part of their internal investigation. Marcus provided his business card, still processing how a simple trip to the supermarket had transformed into this surreal situation. Before Marcus even got home with his groceries, the video was already beginning to spread across social media. The woman who had recorded on her phone posted the clip on her Twitter with a detailed description of what she had witnessed, tagging local news accounts and community activists. The teenage employee who had also filmed sent his version to TikTok, where it began accumulating views at an alarming rate. Within hours, multiple perspectives of the same incident were circulating online, each one confirming the other's story. What made the videos particularly devastating for Richard was how clearly they captured everything. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. The videos showed Richard approaching Marcus aggressively without provocation. They showed him using racially charged language. They showed Marcus remaining calm while being harassed. And crucially, they showed the moment when Margaret, the HR manager, appeared and identified Richard as an employee of her company. It was a complete narrative captured in high-definition video from multiple angles. By Wednesday morning, the story had gone locally viral. Local news stations picked up the video and began covering the story, many of them managing to interview witnesses who were in the supermarket. David Chen, the store manager, gave a statement confirming that Richard had been permanently banned from the establishment for discriminatory conduct. The statement made clear that the supermarket had a zero-tolerance policy for racism and fully supported the actions taken by its staff to protect Marcus. Margaret kept her promise. On Wednesday morning, she was in a meeting with the HR director and CEO of the company where Richard worked. She presented her detailed report on what she had witnessed, including links to the multiple videos now circulating online. The company was a mid-sized accounting firm that served diverse clients and had spent years building a reputation for inclusivity. Seeing one of their long-term employees having a public racist meltdown was a public relations nightmare. The internal investigation was quick, because there was very little ambiguity. The videos were clear. Margaret was a reliable witness and high-ranking employee. Other witnesses were willing to give statements, and the company was beginning to receive calls and emails from people demanding to know why they still employed someone capable of that kind of behavior. The company's social media department was being bombarded with comments and messages, many people tagging the company in the viral videos and demanding action. On Thursday, just 2 days after the supermarket incident, Richard was called into a meeting with Human Resources. He knew what was coming, but apparently still tried to defend himself, claiming he was having a bad day, that things had been taken out of context, that he wasn't really racist. But the company wasn't interested in excuses. They had consulted their lawyers, reviewed all available evidence, and made a decision. Richard Peterson was terminated for cause, effective immediately. The termination notice was detailed and specific. It cited violation of the company's anti-discrimination policies, conduct that brought discredit to the organization, and creation of a hostile environment, even though off-site. The document made clear that Richard was being fired for cause, which meant he would not be entitled to severance and that his benefits package would be immediately terminated. Nearly 20 years at the company ended in a 15-minute meeting. The company also issued a public statement. They condemned Richard's actions in unequivocal terms, affirmed their commitment to diversity and inclusion, and announced they had terminated his employment. The statement was posted on all the company's social media platforms and sent to all clients. It was a calculated move to do damage control, but also a genuine reflection that the company could not tolerate that kind of behavior associated with their brand. Richard tried to contest the termination through labor legal department, arguing that firing for off-work actions was unfair, but his lawyers quickly explained he had very little case. The videos were public and widely circulated, directly associating him with the company. His behavior was clearly discriminatory, and the conduct clause in his employment contract specifically mentioned that behavior bringing discredit to the company was cause for termination. There was no legal loophole through which he could escape the consequences of his own actions. Richard's life crumbled quickly in the following months. Finding a new job proved virtually impossible when potential employers did basic Google searches and immediately found the viral videos of his racist meltdown. Recruiters who initially seemed interested in his extensive resume and 20 years of accounting experience suddenly stopped returning calls once they did their online background checks. The video had become his permanent digital identity, impossible to escape or erase. His financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Without severance and with benefits cut immediately, Richard had to rely on savings that didn't last as long as he hoped. His wife, who had been horrified when she saw the videos, initiated divorce proceedings 3 months after the incident. She told friends she had never seen that side of him before, or perhaps she had simply never paid attention to the signs. Either way, she didn't want to be associated with someone capable of that kind of public hatred. Richard's friends gradually drifted away. Some tried to maintain contact initially, but conversations always returned to the incident, and Richard never really took full responsibility for his actions. He continued to portray himself as a victim of cancel culture, as someone who had a bad moment captured at the worst possible time. But people who watched the full videos knew it wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a prolonged display of racism he clearly had been carrying for a long time. Marcus, on the other hand, used his unexpected platform for something constructive. He began speaking at community events about his experiences with everyday racism, not just the supermarket incident, but the countless microaggressions that happened regularly. He emphasized in his talks that his case had a positive outcome because witnesses spoke up, because someone was recording, because the aggressor's HR manager happened to be present. But how many similar situations happened every day without these advantages? He worked with the supermarket to implement better employee training on how to handle discrimination when it happened in the store. David Chen, the manager, was eager to make improvements and saw this as an opportunity to transform something negative into positive change. They developed clear protocols for employees to follow when witnessing harassment, including intervening immediately, calling management, and preserving any video evidence. The story became a case study used in corporate diversity training across the country, not because of what Richard did, that was sadly common, but because of the immediate response. The manager who didn't hesitate to expel the aggressor. the witnesses who stayed and corroborated the victim's story, the HR manager who happened to witness and acted quickly, the company that took decisive action. It was an example of how systems can work when people choose to do what's right. 2 years after the incident, Marcus still shopped at the same supermarket. He became friends with several employees, including Jessica, the cashier who was working that day. She told him that experience had changed how she viewed her role at work, that she now understood that sometimes doing her job meant more than just scanning items. It meant standing up for customers when they needed it. David Chen was eventually promoted to regional manager, in part because of how he handled that situation. Richard tried to rebuild his life in another state, taking temporary jobs that paid a fraction of what he used to earn. According to reports, he eventually found work at a small accounting firm that either didn't do full background checks or was willing to look past his history. But his reputation followed him. On several occasions, clients recognized him from the viral videos and refused to work with him. His career, which had once been prosperous and stable, never recovered. Richard's wife gave an interview to a local magazine a year after the divorce. She talked about the signs she had ignored over the years, comments she had dismissed as jokes or harmless personal opinions. She said the supermarket incident didn't create his racism, it just exposed it publicly. She expressed shame for not having recognized and confronted those attitudes earlier, and encouraged others in similar relationships to pay attention when partners demonstrated prejudice, even in subtle ways. The lasting legacy of the story wasn't about a racist man losing his job, though that was part of it. It was about the importance of witnesses speaking up, of managers taking firm stands, of companies acting decisively, and of victims being believed and supported. The videos remained online as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences, that public racism would not be tolerated, and that sometimes justice really does happen. Marcus continued being a successful software engineer, but he also became a voice in the community about racial equality. He always ended his talks with the same message. He was lucky because his situation was captured on video, because witnesses intervened, because the right person was in the right place. But thousands of people experience similar racism every day without these advantages. True change would come when all of society decided that standing up for what's right wasn't about having cameras present, but about having moral courage. The supermarket where it all happened placed a small sign near checkout 5, not specifically about the incident, but affirming the store's values. All customers deserve respect, discrimination will not be tolerated, employees are empowered to protect everyone's safety and dignity. It was a silent reminder that this space had been a stage for injustice, but also for accountability. And for Marcus, every time he passed that checkout doing his weekly shopping, he was reminded that sometimes, just sometimes, people do the right thing.